So there isn't too much to the litigation. Of course, as I mentioned, you can have all of that customized. So you may have a little bit of a longer entry process for that. And with that, I don't see any additional questions so far. So we're going to go ahead and launch into our final topic for this section, which is going to be grants management. For that, of course, we're going to go ahead and start by clicking on our top tab for grants management. And here we can see a list of all of the active grants in our demo site. We're going to go ahead and add a new grant together. And we do that through our Actions menu, Add New Grant. And this is, of course, our grant entry form. We can tag our grant to a primary funding source. This is just a lookup, so you can have whatever sources of funding you want in here. And this is, of course, optional. Your funding codes, or grants, I should say, should need a funding code. And the source is going to determine this funding code's name. We, of course, have our active status. The listing weight allows you to change the order of funding codes as they will appear in your dropdowns. So by default, they'll just be alphabetical, but if you want to change that like you can with the lookup list value, you can set a listing weight. We then have some sections for determining when this grant should be available throughout LegalServer. Our first option is to say whether this grant should be available to use on cases. Then we have if this grant should be available for timekeeping and also for outreaches. We'll see in just a second how we can limit this. So I don't have to have this funding code available for every case or every time slip or every type of outreach. But if I want them available on any type of case, timekeeping, or outreach, I want to set these to yes. The dynamic process required to close case is a special feature that allows you to set up an auxiliary process and tie it to this grant. And what will happen is any case that is tagged to this grant is going to be required to enter this process before it can be closed. So for instance, if I set this grant to an auxiliary process called compliance data, the user would have to go through this auxiliary process and enter all of that compliance data before they are allowed to close this case. So it allows you to force completion of some fields, some data points, before this particular case can be closed if it's under this code. The last thing here on our entry form is the option to set up alerts. And what this is it allows you to set alerts when a grant falls to a certain level. So when the money has been spent down to a certain level, you can be notified by email, whoever's configured here. You get to choose what you want your message to be. And then, of course, your alert amount. So when should I get this alert? We'll say when it's gotten down to $1,000 in the fund. Again, we would then choose our users. So whoever should be notified that this has happened. And it's important to note that the alerts only get set once. So you need to set up an alert each time that you get the alert. So if I get the alert at $1,000, then we input more to the fund, we get more funding. I would have to set a new alert if I want to get alerted again when I spend back down to $1,000. This feature requires you to use the options of depositing funds and setting a billing type on your grant, which we'll cover extensively in just a bit. But we'll go ahead and click continue to create this grant. And now we can see the grant profile. So we can see information about the grant. And then all the way at the bottom, we can see some list views for information that we can add to this grant. In our actions menu, we'll have several options here. We can do things like adding a note associated to the grant. This is, again, going to look very similar to your case note entry. And we have that option to upload a document at the same time. And looks like we're missing our notes list view on this profile, but we would see this on the profile, of course, if we had the correct list view here. All right. And then also in our actions menu, we can do things like adding a funding code contact. So again, this would be someone generally that is at this funder who you have contact with. Just like we did earlier, we can search for an existing contact, or we can add a new person to the site if they haven't already been added. And we'll have to navigate back to our grant here. And now we should see that person under our contacts tab on this grant. We can also assign this grant to users, which is essentially saying that these users are responsible for something related to this grant. And we can see that again in our assignments tab. We can also add documents. We saw we could do that with a note, but we can also do that separately, of course. And we can see those again right on that grant profile. And we also have the option for subfolders here as well. And then the last sort of initial thing to show you is that we can also have events, tasks, and deadlines, our calendar records, associated to a funding code, a grant. So for instance, if we want to add a task to this grant, we can add our task. We'll see our due date is on Monday. Click continue. And we can see that task, again, right here on the profile. Now we'll get into some more specifics about the grant and how grants work in LegalServer. The first thing to show you are the grant filters. So when we first created this grant, I mentioned that even if we set it to yes, we want to show this grant for cases, we can still limit it further from there. And that's what our filters are for. So our module is going to be case, outreach, and timekeeping. And again, we can have specific restrictions for either any of these three options. We'll start with a case one. And we'll say that this particular grant, let's say, is only available to female clients. We would select gender as our field, female as our value. We have a start and end date, so if we know that this particular restriction is going to end at a certain spot, we can enter that date. And also, if it hasn't yet started, we can update our start date. Once we click continue, it will add that as a filter or restriction to this grant. We can see that in the list view at the bottom here. We can again do the same for outreach and or timekeeping. So for instance, with timekeeping, if we decided that only certain activity types should be available, so only case time should be supported, for instance, we can select that. And now what will happen is if I'm on a case that is for a male client, this funding code is not going to be available to choose for that case. If I'm on a time slip and it's an outreach time slip, so my activity type is outreach, I won't be able to choose this funding code. You can have as many filters as you need. Just make sure to remember that they are cumulative for each module. So if I have restrictions on the case that it has to be a female client, and I also have one based on disabled equals yes, know that it's only going to show up for cases where the client is female and disabled. So next we're going to talk about depositing funds into our grant, so a way to actually track our funds. And this is what I mentioned earlier is necessary to have those alerts set up. So our first step is to go up to Actions, Deposit Funds. And here we're just depositing the amount that we've gotten for this grant for the year, the quarter, however often you get your funding. Once we click Continue, we will have deposited those funds into the grant. We can do this multiple times. So whenever funding comes in, we can deposit the funds. We then get a link in our action menu for View Fund Activity. And we can see any of those deposits here. Our next step is to update the billing type on this particular grant. So we want to go to this link for Change Billing Type. Here we have a couple of different options. So we have three options for our payment type or our billing type. They are flat rate per client one time. What this is going to do is the first time slip tagged to this funding code on a client will deduct the rate that you enter in this unit rate. So we're going to do $100 as our unit rate. So if I create a new case, it's under this funding code, the first time slip that I enter for that case tagged to this funding code is going to take out $100 from our fund. The next option is flat unit rate hourly. And what this will do is each time slip entered with this funding code will deduct this amount per hour of the time slip. So if I enter a time slip for 2 hours, it's going to deduct $200 from the fund. And that will happen each time I enter a time slip. Our last is variable unit rate, very similar to the last one, but the amount will vary based on the user who is entering the time slip. So each time slip entered with this funding code will deduct the user's hourly rate amount per hour on the time slip. So if my hourly rate is $50 and I spend 2 hours on a time slip tagged to this funding code, it will deduct $100 from that from that funding code. You are still required to enter the unit rate in this case, so that if any users do not have their own specific hourly rate configured, it will then look to this as their hourly rate. We're just going to go ahead and set it for our flat rate to go ahead and just show you how this will work. And actually, apologies, I'm going to set it to our unit rate just in case we have a test case that we've already entered a time slip on. We'll go ahead and then click Continue. And just to point out, you can only have one billing type set on a grant at a time. So if we enter a new billing type, it's going to automatically end the old one and switch over to that new type. To go ahead and show you how this will deduct funds from our grant, we're going to go ahead and go over to a case and enter a time slip. We'll enter for 2 hours. Oh, and apologies, I didn't actually choose our funding code, which is a very important step here. So now we'll enter one for 2 hours tagged to our funding code. And we're going to go back to our grant, refresh, and go view our fund activity. Now we can see here, we've got a deposit, of course, that we initially made, and then we have a deduction as well. So 2 hours based on a $100 flat rate per hour is going to deduct $200 from our fund and show us that we're left now with $4,800. All right, and that is everything to cover as far as grants go. And this, of course, is just our regular grants management, not our advanced module. So all of this is available for everyone in your demo site. Don't see any initial questions again so far, but we are a little bit early on this session. Our next will start at 3:30 Eastern Time. So if anyone has any questions about anything that we covered so far today, please feel free to type those in through the chat screen. So one question so far is just, is the next section only covering pro bono? We will start with documents and document templates and then get into pro bono tools for our last session for the day. All right, so it doesn't sound like we've got any questions from the last section. So we're going to go ahead and go on break. We will be back for documents, document templates, and pro bono tools at 3:30 Eastern.